Cool. Now, good morning. Welcome back to our series on informal chats about everything that relates to the United States. Today, we have the great pleasure to have with us Dr. Sara Polak, who is a colleague from Leiden University, where she teaches US literature, and she also teaches in the North American Studies MA program there. Welcome, Sara. It's great to
Thank
have
you.
you here.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks. Well, now, Sara is not only a great scholar, but she's also a very fine observer of the contemporary United States. Her expertise lies in I would say US political history and also US cultural history. She's been studying the role of memory, for instance, in the definition, in the shaping of America's political culture. And recently, her research projects have tackled important tools of political communication, such as social media. What I found fascinating, for instance, among the many projects that Sara is able to carry on, is this idea of framing and interpreting American presidents as a complex political persona with their own communication style, with their own fabrication, as Sarah's defined it in her writings. And I saw also that you have been studying especially the relationship between Trump and Twitter, which is something that I really want to know more about. But my first question for you, Sara, is drawing from what I read on your personal page in Leiden, I found that you defined, or you have this idea of defining Trump's rhetoric, Trump's political style as particularly fitting this cartoon logic, sort of childish, if you want, irrational way of tackling a complex political issue. Now, do you think that this sort of style, of communication style, is something that is shaping, is affecting deeply America's political culture, political communication, and will survive Trump, or it's going to be destined to finish, to end with this presidency?
Oh, that's a really difficult question, actually. Or it's maybe actually a few questions that you're asking, so that's why it's difficult. But perhaps to unpack a little bit what came before this, I think that so far, or in the past, and to some extent still, we think of the media ecosystem as following a kind of representational logic that is politicians say things and then the media report those messages critically, usually to a large audience, and the audience then reads that and bases their voting behavior on that. So it's a kind of like a circle, an ecosystem of sorts, in which it is very important for the politician to represent some version of the truth. And the same is true for journalists, of course, in a different way. But they each want to represent the facts and the people to some extent. And of course, this is not to say that politicians in the past did not lie. Of course, they took space with the truth, or they gave framings or interpretations of facts that were important. But if they lied, or if they were caught lying, this was a political problem for them. And it was in some sense the task of the press also to, take them to task about what the claims that they made. And so representing things like the facts and representing also people were kind of central elements in the media ecosystem in this loop. And one thing that I think you have to observe immediately is that this loop has really fundamentally changed. It's not an arrow that goes in one direction, but all the arrows go in various directions. So For instance, what I think is incredibly important in this is that you as a user of social media or media in general are no longer just a consumer, but you also are a producer of media content, or you can be, or you can, take an important role in circulating new content. So you become kind of what I and other people also, this is not a term that I've come up with, but have called, you become a prosumer, both a producer and a consumer. And that really, and that's one thing that I see Trump doing a lot. And so, when I call Trump a cartoon president, that's of course kind of funny, but I want to stress that I take this issue very seriously. So I'm not saying it in a dismissive way, in a sort of let's not take Trump seriously, because I think this is a really, Trump is kind of a symptom of something happening to the media ecosystem that really overhauls everything, and really we need to deal with, because what you see a lot in the media is that journalists try to stick to this old kind of representational model, and it doesn't quite work that way anymore. And I think, we have to make sense of how it now does work. And I think Trump, in a sense, is at the forefront of understanding how it works. And to give an example of that, what you can see Trump doing a lot with his use of Twitter is that he writes tweets that are textual, but that kind of contain almost a political cartoon. So he will write, this is a while ago, but about Kim Jong-un, he will write, I have a nuclear button too, but my button is bigger than yours. And in that text, you immediately see an image of two men, one with a small button, one with a big button. And immediately after that, like in the hour after that, versions of that image had been produced. So what Trump produced was just text, but people responded by making that image and circulating that. And of course, then you have derivatives of that, of two men, comparing their penises and whatnot. But, that's sort of... so what he does is he really incites and sparks this sort of prosumer culture. And he really kind of gives them, fodder in a way for the production of memes. And I think this is very different from how it used to work in this kind of old model where, a politician was always the object of political cartooning, right? This was, traditionally, political cartoons are in a sense, always making fun of politicians. And this was kind of, the price you paid for power. And the way that this works for Trump is actually, it's not exactly the reverse, but it's very different. That he incites the production of political cartoons. And even when they're actually critical of him, they sort of help him because they generate a lot of attention. And, this whole generating attention and generating a sense of outrage is really kind of, as I see it, a key trick for him, a key, the reason why he is so successful at always kind of generating and holding media attention, and therefore.
It's something that obviously reads into the way that he uses social media, and I really agree with that's a really interesting insight there. Do you think it has kind of wider applications? If you think about the way that Trump is a president who focuses on symbols, who's very conscious of kind of visual, like the photo opportunity, right? You can think of anything from like his recent joyride out of the hospital, holding up the Bible, the press conference with Kim Jong-un. Like, I think back to some of the early appointments that he took to his cabinet, right? Where he hired somebody like General James Mattis and said something along the lines of, this is a guy straight out of central casting, right?
Yeah.
It's very, he's somebody who comes out of TV, somebody who comes out of branding.
Absolutely.
Who's very conscious of kind of the look of things, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true. And I think that's also why we have to take this seriously. Like, it's very easy to think that, Trump clearly doesn't know a whole lot about many things that we would expect normally a president to know about, but he's certainly extremely good at this, and he has a kind of like sixth sense for that kind of thing. One thing that I particularly enjoyed in the context of this cartoon logic was reading that he had that Trump had, when he was in hospital, considered when he came out to come out in a Superman suit. So he would like open his jacket and you'd see like the Superman shirt, because I think that really fits the same, exactly what you were saying, Case. All of those examples of how he thinks about presenting a particular image, that actually really buys from television culture and also superhero culture and cartoon culture. So I think that's really true. And of course, this is something that in one way or another presidents in the past have done as well, but never to this extent and never in this kind of really new media ecosystem. And I think, there are, of course, also contemporary other politicians who are doing similar things.
You're right, because in the past, if not anything else, you had to go through the mediation of media in order to make sure that your political messages, even your political image, could steer popular imaginations. Whereas now it's everything more direct. And I have in mind, the image of Trump taking off his face mask as a moment of almost national liberation, and that is a powerful message indeed. But there is something else in this, because I think Obama, for instance, was perhaps the very first politician to use social media and to use this new ecosystem in a strategic way, right?
Well, he had the Google guys working on his campaign. A lot of from Google,
I mean, even the picture of hugging Michelle after 2012 elections, that was a photo ad in itself, right? So I don't think Trump is the first one to capitalize on it. But the difference here is about the quality, even if you want the morality of the political message. Do you think that this will in the end characterize political communications for the years to come, a sort of race, to the bottom line?
Well, I certainly think that is ongoing at the moment, and what will happen in the future, I think, is difficult to really gauge, because I mean, it depends on so many contingencies. But I have seen in the last year, since 2015, 2016, you have seen also that journalists and the media more broadly, as well as citizens, have increasingly also learned to some extent how to deal with these things. So there's some degree in which you see, for instance, that initially, I remember quite early on when the Russian investigation got going, Trump suddenly started tweeting all these like really offensive things about Meryl Streep, and everyone in the media was like, "Oh, he said tweeting about Meryl Streep. We should pay attention to that." And it was clearly a smokescreen. And I think that now, a couple of years later, they've become better at this. They've realized that it's always kind of Trump doing this. Look, your shoelace is untied.
Even though traditional journalists, they blame him to be the crazy uncle who cannot tweet everything or retweet everything that goes out there. I mean, this is really, really interesting, and yet I keep thinking that in a way, the ways in which Trump now communicates is, self-sustaining. Now that he's busy with this struggle, almost, epical struggle, to delegitimize traditional media channels, this attack on fake news and crooked media, I see it almost as a point of no return. And then my question is, do you think that this is a danger for the very stability of American democracy? in which, the free press and the role of media, traditional media, has always been so crucial in managing the electoral campaign and political elections.
Yeah, no, I think that is a very real risk. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there's if you look at, how extremely, the Republican Party has tied its fate to Donald Trump, that means that it's very hard for, that makes the whole system of checks and balances difficult, for instance. And but also, one thing that has struck me lately is that, everybody is asking, is Trump going to accept the outcome of the elections, and asking him, are you going to accept the outcome of the elections if you lose? And I think, no, I have a hard time thinking of other politicians or presidents who would ever be asked that question. It's a kind of most political systems, or in so far that's been a complete taboo, actually, that there's of course you accept the outcomes of an election, and if you treat Trump as someone who might not, and start asking him this question, you might almost give him the idea, or give certain parts of the electorate the idea that this is, a serious option. And so there is a kind of, I think, if you, I mean, this can really, I think, have detrimental effects. On the other hand, you see other, there are other, I also think that the US particularly is ready for a kind of transformational, progressive, FDR style, old-fashioned president, in a sense. So I think that the only thing is that I doubt that Biden is going to be that. And candidates that there were during the Democratic primary that might have been that have not managed to really occupy that position. So, it can go.
The parallel to FDR came out also in one of our initial chats. The last question I had in this regard was about the responsibility of traditional media themselves, in the reshuffling, in the complete subversion of this ecosystem. I have in mind, for instance, the ways in which the Washington Post treated initially Trump's campaign back in 2016, not even, giving him space in the political section of the newspaper, but confining it to popular culture or even comedy at certain point. Do you think that this dismissive attitude has, in a way, given space and room for this prosumer culture, a culture that rejects that role of political mediation that media have played in favor of a Twitter presidency, basically? I say whatever I want, and you have to consider that as a fact, as truth.
Yeah, so I think that media certainly have a large responsibility here, and I think that, on the one hand, I agree with you that Trump has been treated kind of too dismissively, in a way that, was kind of oil on the fire for his sort of most kind of close supporters. And on the other hand, of course, they've given Trump more attention than he deserves, in a sense. Like, in a way, the one thing that made Trump electable in the first place was that he got so much attention. And I think you have to take into account also then that, a lot of news media, certainly in the US, also rely very heavily on clicks. And so, I'm reminded, for instance, of a couple of weeks ago when, Jacob Blake was shot in the back in Kenosha, and Trump went there, and everybody was like, don't do that, don't go there, it'll only escalate things. And he just, of course, does go there, because then he's world news again. The conversation is about him, not about racism, and also, everywhere in the world, even in here. it was front page news that Trump was going to Kenosha. And so I think the media have also really inflated him in that sense by always, going where the action is, and that is always Trump, because he always does something that seems outrageous. Although of course it also gets predictable, and they do learn to deal with that. And of course the other set of media companies that have a responsibility here are those platforms like Facebook and Twitter and so on, that always have said, look, we're not responsible for content. We're a platform. So, everybody who puts content on it has responsibility for that themselves. And it's now become increasingly clear that, citizens can develop more kind of media literacy, and traditional media should perhaps be a bit more savvy about how they report these things. But really, those massive media companies that are platforms and don't create any content, still have to carry some kind of responsibility for it, because they're the only ones that can. And so then the question, of course, is how are you going to do that? And it's strange that a commercial company has to arbitrate whether something is true or not, and that runs into all kinds of issues then, of course. And that's also complicated because, for instance, a company like Twitter, might easily have lost its relevance had Trump not been elected president in 2016. So, there's a kind of symbiosis where Twitter also depends on him.
Yeah, if you ask us as a historian, I think that there's also the problem of retention of these sources. So, yeah. Sorry, Case, I didn't want to.
Yeah, no, sorry, Dario. It's just what Sara was mentioning. What you mentioned there was about sort of taking into account the logic on which these platforms themselves operate. I'm not sure I like the word platform, because it sort of implies, right, a level playing field.
Absolutely, yeah.
In a sense,
which it isn't.
Which it isn't. No, if there is a platform, it is very much kind of sloped towards a certain logic, and that is the logic, in a sense, of essentially capitalist accumulation, making money out of holding people's attention. And in a sense, we've been, in a sense, perhaps a little naive by sort of charging these platforms to do more about sort of breaking people out of echo chambers, taking sort of a more assertive stance on issues like fake news, without, I think, fully comprehending just how deeply, if these companies would actually take that sort of criticism to heart and take that seriously, that would cut very, very deeply into their funding models, right? They thrive on, and this latter point you mentioned, that Trump, in a sense, is part of this kind of click ecosystem, and he, in a sense, his behavior in the real world is in a sense driven by sort of what will get him the most clicks on social media. Which, if you think about kind of how that logic operates and that exchange, I mean, I'm reminded of the I don't know, do you remember Pokemon Go? That game around years ago, which was a really interesting thing, because it allowed people, by creating this kind of digital environment in which you could get rewards by being in certain places. You created this game that kind of drove people's behavior in the real world, right? Starbucks would buy a Poke Gym and sort of to drive lots of people on their phones sort of looking for Pokemon in Starbucks. And in a sense, what we're seeing here is another manifestation of that kind of that behavior from the digital world kind of spilling over into the physical, where some of Trump's behaviors, his governing style, is driven by this kind of interfacing with social media. And I mean, I don't pretend to fully understand the implications of that, but I do think it is sort of cause for concern if you think about what the underlying logic of those platforms is to sort of hold people's attention for longer and longer into ever kind of more closely tailored environments.
Yeah. And I think the problem is, of course, that no one really understands the implications of this. It's very difficult to really have a like oversee what's going on, and that also means that you know, we're kind of eternally too late in responding to it. I totally agree with you on, you know, platforms is kind of a word that has clearly been generated by that industry that wants to suggest that it is flat. And, you know, of course, social media in itself is a problematic term. It's not like they're social, they're antisocial, if anything. You know, what they do is they thrive on polarization, and that's of course why, you know, why the fit with someone like Donald Trump and you know, some other politicians is so successful. that if you look at, you know, other presidents who've had a specific symbiosis with a particular medium, like Franklin Roosevelt in radio, or like John F. Kennedy in television, those were media that really helped forge this kind of sense of like imagined community, to use Benedict Anderson's term. That this is like everyone was listening to Roosevelt on the radio at the same time across the country, and this gave people kind of a shared experience as if they all knew each other, which of course, you know, wasn't possible. But and I think here, yeah, the you know, your bubble is tailored to what will hold your attention and what will not annoy you when you look at the advertisements that these you know, companies also feed you, or you know, that there's that means that those bubbles are so different, and you don't really realize how different you're, you know, unless. So I kind of have two Twitter accounts where I, you know, one as myself, if you will, and one where I follow kind of the alt-right scene in the US. And it's really, you know, the worldview couldn't be more different. There isn't a single fact that my two Twitter bubbles agree on. And so, yeah, you see quickly how, yeah, how difficult, you know, if you have no basis to agree at all on anything, then, yeah,
I mean, this
that's problematic.
and it's related again on the consequences, if you want, of this change. Even if you know, if you want the cultural consequences, the broader cultural consequences of this change in the communication ecosystem. But I wanted to go back a little bit to the relationship between political power, or the center of political power in the United States presidents, and these media, because you mentioned, of course, JFK and FDR as being in a way dependent for their successful political communication on the success of a given media, radio or TV. But I'm not sure if the other way around was true as well, whether or not the success of the media depended on their political communication. Whereas what you were saying for Trump is also the other way around, that the success of Twitter depended on it. So my question would be, I mean, I'm older than Case. I can tell you that. So I still have a Facebook account, and he doesn't. And I think this is the main generational gap that there is between us. That I am still on Facebook and he is not. And I don't have an Instagram account nor a TikTok one. So the question is, do you think that is really the media the instrument determining the success of a president, or is it still the other way around?
Well, I think it's probably still the other way around, but I don't want to underestimate the importance of the specific what I'm inclined to call affordances of a social media, like a specific social media platform. So, for instance, you know, Twitter, because it allows for retweeting, is really a circulation kind of platform. It really, the circulating material is very important, and because the messages are very short, it doesn't allow for a lot of nuance. And Instagram, for instance, revolves very much around images and the visual, of course. And And another platform like 4chan, that it's that in the past kind of made the alt-right big in the US, was a message board for comics and cartoon lovers. So it was a comics message board that was kind of turned into or hijacked by these kind of alt-right forces. And that's actually kind of more of a production platform. So people, made memes or comics and put them on 4chan, and then they were circulated through Twitter and Reddit and whatnot. And so I think that it is no coincidence that Trump is on that Trump's platform of choice is one that allows for circulation primarily, and one that allows for short messages only. Um, and yeah, I think that partly because of Trump, but not entirely, Twitter is one of those platforms that has relatively few subscribers. If any group that you ask who here has a Twitter account, it'll be like one person, or maybe, I think that 1% of most populations have a Twitter account. So it's really not kind of like Facebook in the past, or maybe Insta or Twitter or TikTok for younger people, is like the platform that everybody is on. But it is the platform that all journalists and politicians are on. And I think that in that sense, it has a specific role. And one mistake that media outlets often make is that they take Twitter to be kind of like the vox populi. So sort of this is what the man in the street thinks, when really it isn't. It really there's a very specific population on Twitter.
No, but you're right about the text, because I mean, I remember reading, for instance, very long statuses on Facebook by Obama, because there you had the space to elaborate on.
Exactly. Yeah.
Whereas on Twitter, this is impossible, and that's why it fits Trump.
Yeah, exactly.
My question is, what will happen when Twitter won't be around anymore? I mean, when people lose interest, will abandon.
I don't know, and I don't know whether Trump will go out before Twitter does, or the other way around, or they will, lead to each other's demise. I can't predict that, but I do think that one task for coming politicians will be to navigate what are then the platforms where you kind of have to skate where the puck is, in that sense.
Yeah.
It bears thinking about as well is how are these different social media platforms making money, and how will they continue to make money in the future? And for a larger organization, Twitter's problem, in a sense, in a purely kind of business point of view, is that it's kind of the data that it has access to is in fact kind of relatively limited, right? Facebook has a lot. Facebook has a lot more information that's fed to it by its users that can then be used to construct sort of ever more sophisticated algorithms. Amazon and Google are now placing devices in people's homes that they can use to kind of record speech and sort of find ways to predict more and more sophisticated forms of human behavior and monetize that. And Twitter, in a sense, has kept because its profile is relatively limited. The number of data is relatively. Sure, go.
No, I was going to say, I'm glad that you make this point, because that's one thing that I meant to say still, is that Twitter, of all of these companies, platforms, whatever, is not the worst, like by a long distance in this particular respect. It is, it's a cliche by now to say that if the product is free, you are the product. But actually, Twitter is, in that sense, is relatively reticent, actually, in what it takes from you and how it monetizes that information.
Right.
And you have a fair choice in terms of, Twitter kind of does have an algorithm to feed you tweets that they think you'll like, but you can also just there's also a setting where you can say, I want to see tweets in the order that they are tweeted by the people I follow and not by anyone else. And that's really, Facebook is completely different. Facebook is you have no insight at all in what you see and why.
You know what is supposed to be your contact bubble.
Yeah, exactly. Then Facebook really makes that for you, and Twitter, you have much more insight into how that works and more choice.
It's sometimes noted that in addition to studying computer science at Harvard, Mark Zuckerberg double majored in psychology.
Yeah.
And that a lot of kind of the way that these kind of platforms operate, I mean, there's a certain sort of logic of accumulation, right? The way that they convert these sort of their insights into money, but there's also a psychological logic at work where they are, in a sense, they are built to exploit the kind of cognitive traps that the human mind sets for ourselves, right? Like we like the idea of confirmation bias, the idea that we actually quite like opinions that sort of confirm our view of the world. I mean, you can list a whole set of cognitive biases and think about sort of how social media companies are built to exploit those. Do you think that, in a sense, translates also to Trump's political style? Is he a president? Is he a communicator that, in a sense, exploits the way that sort of the human psychology operates in that sense?
Well, yes and no. I think that, for instance, like Mark Zuckerberg is a good example, but many of these companies actually have a very sophisticated and well thought through idea of these cognitive biases that you mentioned. And I think that Trump, I mean, I'm always very hesitant to, make guesses about what goes on in Trump's mind. But I think that the way he operates is highly intuitive, that he probably couldn't follow this conversation because we're using fairly abstract terms, and it's taking longer than a few minutes. But I think that his kind of his sort of it does have a way of speaking to the lizard brain, the kind of our very basic drives and needs, and he has an intuition for that is right every time. So I think that in a sense the effect may be similar, but there hasn't
do you think
people like Zuckerberg might have really thought about this in a way that I don't think Trump has.
Do you think it has been right every time? I mean, not to make any predictions because the election is 2 weeks off and anything at this point can still happen. But he's behind a fair bit in the polls, and a lot of predictive models which we can take with a grain of salt. But you can clearly see that compared to 2016, certainly in the context of the pandemic, that communication style is not winning him as much support as it seemed to have done in the past. So have we cottoned on to it? Has he gotten worse at it? Is there something about the conditions that isn't as favorable to that kind of style of communication?
Yeah, I think that what he constantly is doing hasn't really changed, and maybe it's less able now to attract votes, or it's but I think that it depends also what the aim is if I wonder whether he's truly primarily dedicated to getting as many votes as he wants to. And I think ways that in recent days he's been mocking seniors, that I genuinely don't think that that's going to win him votes among seniors, which are the electoral blocks that he does need. So I think that in that sense, it's maybe not wise in a kind of 2 weeks before the elections sense, but it does always manage to kind of rally attention around him. There is a sort of, he's extremely good at being loved by his supporters, and that's the main thing that he wants. And if that wins him the elections, then that's great. And if it doesn't win him the elections, he's going to say the elections are rigged.
Is that perhaps the narrative then, that Trump was created himself through social media, and often in the end, I mean, he might win the election, he might also lose it, But in the end, if he loses, we might as well say it was because he fell victim to this very same cognitive trap where he becomes trapped in his own filter bubble and only really cares about that specific audience that he can speak to that always sort of will agree with him and praise with him. And that he, in a sense, he forgot to or became uninterested in communicating with a larger audience outside. He's forgotten that Twitter is not the world.
Yeah, well, like I do genuinely think that he perceives himself as existing in what I call a cartoon universe. So I think that's true. I think he's entirely caught up in that universe. I would hesitate to think of that in terms of victimhood, because you know, I perhaps he would be even more a victim of himself if he became president again. I don't have the impression he enjoys it. But yeah, I mean, and generally, I think Trump is not the big victim here. But yeah, no, but I see what you're saying, and I agree with it.
What I was thinking when you were talking about this cognitive bubble and this psychological relationship between Twitter and this new ecosystem together, is that perhaps Trump's only aim is to capitalize on this new instrument that our society that is growing more and more narcissistic is giving us to showcase our own personality. And in a way, I think this is all he is interested in doing, showing off. And thinking that doing that on Twitter will buy him audience and a reliable basing of votes, of consensus, more than just electoral support. I mean, he has finally the megaphone is always looked for. And of course, this allowed him to win the presidency. But if that won't be the case this year, maybe you're right. Maybe he will just not care, because he will be an egotist with his big microphone on.
Yeah. So I think that I remember in 2016 there were these plans for a big media conglomerate called Trump Media that would sort of off of all of the attention that his being a candidate in the elections had generated, would start this kind of media company where Trump would be kind of the heart of everything, sort of not just a website but also television and whatnot. And I think I remember then that I thought, this has always been the aim, not necessarily becoming president, but yeah, generating this massive media platform. Right. And I think that that's still that could still be something that he wants to do, but he accidentally then became president and he had to go with it in a way.
But you've been very good also in analyzing the ways in which Trump has used this media to project whatever contorted, irrational, and inconsistent they may have been, is used Twitter also to channel his ideas. And then some of them were also related to Ebola, to the ways in which Obama was dealing with that pandemic. And now he's in the middle of it, on the other hand. So any change or any continuity, surprising continuity in this regard, in the ways in which he has addressed public health?
Yeah, I think so. During the Ebola epidemic of 2013 to 15, more or less, in West Africa, Trump was not yet, of course, a presidential candidate, but a very vocal tweeter. Also, of course, in the in the whole debate about, or to call it a debate is giving it too much. But about whether Obama was born in the US, he was really one of the drivers of the birther movement, even though, there was, of course, no doubt at all about Obama being born in the US. He really sparked that movement. And I think with what I've come to call the Ebola scare in the US, so the sort of fear that this disease would come to the US, Trump too, was a very vocal tweeter. And he really used this to kind of fan the flames of xenophobia, and to sort of say, look, these people are kind of like zombies and they're trying to overrun our country and bring their terrible disease here so that we will become like them. And this went pretty far in terms of like fictionality, in a sense. It was almost as if he saw this as the zombie apocalypse that was about to happen, like in terms of the discourse that he used to tweet about it. And so and I think we've seen him trying to do the same thing initially with COVID, right? With the sort of really framing it as a Chinese virus, which was caused by either created in Chinese labs or caused by Chinese people eating bats. And this is a kind of standard way of exoticizing the other, is they just say they eat weird things and they make these diseases that they then try and spread from the inside out in our country. And it's part of a large set of tools of othering the racialized other that Trump used during Ebola for West Africa, and then initially during Corona crisis for China. And then, of course, now that the US is kind of one of the world's largest center of the outbreak, and Trump himself is also that. He's kind of let go of that framing. Has been forced to let go of that framing because it's not something that he can keep out anymore, but it's something that has indeed infested him. And he's kind of gone over to another very traditional framing of disease, certainly among presidents, they to say that it's nothing and he's overcome this disease, and so it's not a big deal. He is a kind of embodiment of the nation, and he has overcome the disease, so the nation will as well. And this is in itself, that of course, a problematic way of talking and thinking about disease. But there too he taps into a pre-existing cultural narrative. So he's kind of he's had to change tactics, but at the same time he's kind of continued being part of kind of standard narratives.
Yeah, but very powerful narratives, right? I mean, on the one hand, the overcoming of a disease, almost an heroic gesture from an American president, and on the other hand, the xenophobia, this sort of ethnographic nationalism applied to public health. We need our national interest that becomes the interest of defending our own health against the attack of something coming from abroad. So I was wondering, to what extent is the Democratic Party be able to cope with such powerful narratives in ways that are still rational, grounded on reality, and at the same time appealing?
Yeah, I mean, this is a difficult combination, clearly. I think that on the one hand, of course, there is a large public in the US, probably, I think, numerically a majority, who believes in science and who wants to follow regulations that will, stop or temper the spread and so on. So I think that all of those, like social distancing and wearing masks and whatnot, those measures have a lot of popular support generally. But at the same time, it's not a kind of easy, sexy story. It doesn't tap into, the zombie movies that people have seen, or the presidential superhero narratives that are around. And it makes campaigning very hard for Biden, because he's, of course, he doesn't want to attract corona, and of course he shouldn't. And he wants to kind of project this image of people socially distanced at his events and wearing masks, and that is, that also generates images of someone on the campaign trail who attracts no attention, because there is no large enthusiastic crowd, and the enthusiasm gap has already been Biden's problem, and so there's now no way of mending that in the last few weeks, which which in the past has often happened with presidents who initially didn't generate that kind of enthusiasm, then towards the end did. Like Hillary Clinton, for instance, yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering to what extent it can generate also questions about Biden's ability to overcome the virus in the same way in which Trump did. He's older, he may be portrayed as weaker, talks about immunity, whatever it means, with this virus already surrounding the aura, the image of Trump. So, yeah, I think this is generating.
Does that really work though? Like you can see how it's difficult to, like, you can't at the same time kind of minimize the effects of the virus on people's health and at the same time present yourself as a heroic figure for overcoming it, right? Trump, according to Trump, never.
But Trump does both, right?
Yeah, exactly. This is Trump's superpower.
I mean, I think I see your point, and I agree with it. And I think there are many people, also voters in the US, who agree with it. And at the same time, I think that the trap with Trump is that he constantly does this kind of plays two cards at the same time that are contradictory,
right?
And yet it works somehow.
So
there is a sort of
double thing.
Or it can work.
Believing two contradictory things at the same time, but isn't sort of part of? I mean, you mentioned kind of the pre-existing narrative of kind of the zombie movie that helps people to frame and make sense of pandemics and how they're going to play out. But isn't that exactly the point, that people don't want to live in a zombie movie? It's not a very fun place to be in. And sure, you had that initial kind of panic buying, which I think, you very clearly can see that kind of playbook of how you're supposed to act within a pandemic that's kind of inspired by kind of cultural frames and references, kind of leading a life of its own. But we are, in a sense, beyond that now, aren't we? Yeah. Where, in a sense, this is no longer your zombie movie pandemic. This is just something that's, it's not something that excites our lives necessarily anymore. It dulls it down, right? Mm-hmm. You're supposed to wear a mask. Yeah. You're supposed to socially distance, and then the very dullness, in a sense, of the image that the Democratic campaign is presenting is, in a sense, quite conform to the reality in which people are experiencing the virus and probably want to experience it, right?
Yeah.
It's better, to have like a dull virus than like your zombie movie virus.
Right. Yeah. And so I think, you can argue that, this drags an already dull candidate further down. And on the other hand, if it's true that people want to, they are embracing, as I'm sure a lot of people are embracing the kind of dullness of having to go through this, then it makes sense for your candidate to do that too, and to perform doing that. So I think I don't know which of those two will weigh more heavily. So as I was saying, I think that on the one hand there could have been a more transformational, more truly inspiring presidential Democratic candidate, and there are a lot of people who would love that, and who are deploring the fact that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is too young to be this. And on the other hand, I think that one reason why Trump won against Hillary Clinton was that she generated so much antagonistic feeling herself. Whereas because she was a pronounced and she stood out as a candidate, of course, primarily because she was a woman. But I think that in that sense, having a boring candidate next to Trump is not a bad idea, because some people want that.
And you can question the extent to which perhaps in a year that would have gone differently, but you can question, to what extent sort of a message of kind of radical economic reform of the sort of that Bernie Sanders or an Elizabeth Warren would have propagated, how much space there would have been within a media landscape and an attention landscape that also has Trump and the pandemic in it?
Yeah, that's true. That's yeah. So, I mean, if you, I remember, when Trump had just had COVID, there was this whole sort of expectation in the media that now he would be more careful or he would be wiser and he would not hold these rallies and whatnot. And you think that I thought then that he's not going to do that because, there's a large section of the population that wants that and another section of the population that doesn't want that. And it makes sense that they play to two different audiences. And I think something similar is true with being wise and reasonable and boring. That there's it makes sense to put next to a candidate like Trump someone who is reasonable and boring. It because that that gives people a binary choice, and the system revolves around binary choices.
Yeah, the problem is that then if you analyze the electorate, you have on the one hand an electorate that is very much homogeneous, more cohesive, that is the Republican one, whereas the Democratic one still is within itself polarized, divided, and finding consensus around a figure that maybe boring, maybe not so charismatic or not so inspiring as other candidates could have been, is still difficult. It's still a big test.
I mean, it is a little bit of a cliche by now to say that the Republicans are a more cohesive, internally cohesive party. I firstly think that's exaggerated. But secondly, yes, it's easier to be cohesive if you are numerically in a minority, right? The Republicans simply represent a smaller portion of the electorate. And to fill the space that they have kind of left in the political center, the Democratic coalition has had to be more inclusive and more embracive, and therefore more conflictuous than the Republicans.
Yeah, they are a minority indeed, a very vocal one, very much present, powerful also from a political point of view in some crucial states, a minority. But I mean, if you take the book of it, the white, I don't want to say necessarily white supremacist, but the white conservative minority of the country can still be dominant in these elections. That's why, Sarah, this is something we haven't done so far, but now we are just weeks away from the election. So I wanted to ask you, what's your gut feeling? Who do you think is going to win?
Yeah, my gut feeling is that Trump is going to lose the popular vote but win the election, possibly steal the election.
Okay, how?
So I think that yeah, if you look at polls right now, they all kind of come out in favor of Biden, but not that strongly. And I think that there are just there's quite a bit of potential or real voter suppression going on among parts of the electorate who are poor and non-white, who might say on a poll that they would vote for Biden but won't actually do so. And I think that the whole rallying the vote is crucial at this moment. And I wonder if that's going well enough. Whereas I think for Trump, it actually I can see that there might be a lot of voters who will end up voting for Trump, even if they now say they're undecided or say they might vote for Biden or might not vote at all, who might end up so I think there are more people who might end up voting for Trump, and there are also quite a lot of people who now would say they're voting for Biden but might end up not voting. But
yeah,
this is of course a guess, and I've been very wrong in the past, so
we're putting you on the spot here.
No, but thanks a lot, Sarah. This has been really, really great, interesting, full of insight. Thanks a lot also for your fine analysis of America's political communication and political culture. I know you will be busy following the elections with different events, both nationally and locally here in Leiden. So good luck with the next few weeks. And thanks again for being with us today.
Thank you very much.
you.
It was lovely talking to you. Bye.